If you stand on the edge of a New England pond in the dead of winter, the silence is almost absolute. The water is locked beneath a thick, heavy sheet of solid ice. The air is sharp and still. But imagine, for a moment, breaking that silence with the steady, rhythmic scraping of an iron saw. Imagine taking this frozen, heavy, fragile piece of winter, packing it in the dark, and sending it across the blazing equator. Today, we take the cold for granted. We open a white metal door in our kitchen, and a gentle artificial breeze washes over us. We drop perfectly identical cubes of ice into our glasses without a second thought. Cold is cheap. Cold is instantaneous. Cold is a mechanical guarantee. But there was a time, not so long ago, when cold was a seasonal privilege. It belonged only to the winter. When the spring thaw came, the warmth returned, food spoiled rapidly, and a cold drink in the middle of July was a luxury reserved only for the extraordinarily wealthy. For millennia, humanity tried to capture the cold. In ancient Persia, engineers built yakhchals, massive domed evaporative coolers made of heat-resistant mud brick, towering above the desert to store winter ice. The Romans sent fleets of slaves into the mountains to carry down packed snow wrapped in straw. Across the ancient world, from China to the Mediterranean, ice was hoarded in deep underground pits. But this cold was strictly local, and it belonged to emperors, kings, and the elite. To bring the winter to the ordinary kitchen and to move it across the oceans, humanity had to build a quiet, massive, and highly orchestrated system. This is the story of the natural ice trade and the wooden boxes that kept the world cool. In the early years of the 19th century, the idea of shipping ice for profit seemed completely absurd. Ice was just frozen water. It was heavy, it was difficult to move, and most importantly, it melted. It was a product that literally disappeared into a puddle of water if you took too long to deliver it. But a Boston merchant named Frederick Tudor saw something else. He looked at the frozen lakes of Massachusetts and saw an untapped harvest. His logic was simple. People in sweltering climates would pay a premium for a taste of the cold. In 1806, Tudor purchased a brig, loaded it with blocks of natural ice cut from a local pond, and set sail for the tropical island of Martinique in the Caribbean. The execution, however, was a logistical nightmare. You cannot simply drop bare ice into the humid, sweltering hold of a wooden ship. The salt air and the radiant heat of the ocean would turn the cargo to water in days, sloshing dangerously in the bilge. Tudor and his successors had to essentially turn their ships into floating thermos flasks. They built double hulls within the ships, leaving an empty cavity between the outer wood and the inner hold. They packed this space with peat, hay, or thick layers of pine sawdust. The air inside the hold was heavily scented with the smell of damp pine, mixing with the salty ocean breeze. Workers had to stack the blocks so tightly that they formed a single solid frozen mass, preventing them from shifting and crushing the wooden hull during violent storms. Despite these early efforts, Tudor's first trip to Martinique was a financial disaster. While the ice survived the ocean voyage reasonably well, there was no insulated infrastructure to store it once it arrived in the tropics. Much of it melted away. Tudor lost money, and the world mocked him, calling it a fool's errand. But the vision of moving winter across the world did not die. It just needed better engineering. And that engineering did not come in the form of a steam engine or a complex gear. It came in the form of agricultural tools and wood scraps. While Frederick Tudor had the relentless drive, the true mechanics of the ice trade were perfected by his associate, an inventor named Nathaniel Wyeth. Wyeth observed the chaotic, exhausting process of men trying to cut ice with simple hand saws. In 1829, he patented a horse-drawn ice cutter. This simple device featured parallel iron blades. It was pulled across the frozen lakes by a horse, scoring deep, perfectly straight grooves into the ice, creating a vast geometric grid. Workers could then use long iron bars to effortlessly snap off massive, uniform rectangular blocks. Suddenly, ice was no longer jagged and random. It was standardized, It was a stackable, predictable commodity, just like bricks or lumber. But cutting the ice was only half the battle. The true enemy was the heat. How do you keep a frozen block of water from melting during a 4-month ocean voyage to India, or through a blistering summer in a warehouse? The answer was found in the waste piles of lumber yards. Sawdust. Sawdust is an incredible natural insulator. It is composed of tiny wood particles that trap millions of microscopic pockets of still air. When thick blocks of ice were stacked closely together in a warehouse and then deeply packed with layers of dry sawdust, the trapped air prevented the outside heat from reaching the ice. It was a beautiful, quiet synergy of two natural materials: the frozen water of the lake protected by the shredded wood of the forest. With Wyatt's cutting tools and the magic of sawdust insulation, the natural ice trade exploded. Massive, windowless, double-walled wooden ice houses were built along the shores of ponds. During the freezing weeks of January and February, armies of men and horses would descend upon the ice. The air would echo with the scraping of saws and the heavy thuds of frozen blocks sliding up wooden ramps into the dark, insulated warehouses, resembling massive, silent cathedrals of cold. From there, the ice began its global journey. Ships heavily laden with Massachusetts winter sailed to Havana, to Rio de Janeiro, to Bombay, and to Calcutta. It is a profound thought. A piece of a frozen pond from Walden, sitting quietly in the dark belly of a wooden ship, crossing the blazing heat of the equator, just to cool a drink in India, months later. But the ice trade did not just cater to wealthy merchants in distant lands. By the mid-19th century, it began to change the daily rhythm of ordinary life back home. Before this era, families preserved their food by salting, smoking, or pickling. Fresh meat and milk had to be consumed quickly, or they would spoil. But as the supply of natural ice became abundant and affordable, a new piece of furniture began to appear in middle-class kitchens: the wooden icebox. The antique icebox was a masterpiece of simple, quiet design. Usually crafted from sturdy woods like oak, ash, or walnut, it looked like a beautiful, heavy cabinet. Inside, however, it was a carefully engineered microclimate. The walls of the icebox were packed with sawdust, cork, or mineral wool for insulation. The interior compartments were lined with zinc or tin to prevent the melting water from rotting the wood. The mechanics of the icebox relied purely on the laws of physics. The compartment holding the block of ice was placed at the top. As the ice slowly melted, it cooled the air around it. Because cold air is denser and heavier than warm air, it naturally sank down into the lower compartments, washing over the milk, the butter, and the fresh meat. The warm air from the food would rise to the top, hitting the ice, cooling down, and repeating the cycle. It was a silent, mechanical loop with no moving parts. The only sound it made was the slow, steady drip of melting water falling into a drain pan underneath the cabinet, which had to be emptied by hand every day. Because an icebox required a constant supply of ice to function, it created a new, vital human routine in the cities. It birthed the era of the Iceman. Every morning, neighborhoods would wake up to the rhythmic clip-clop of heavy draft horses pulling ice wagons down the cobblestone streets. Families who needed a delivery would place a square cardboard sign in their front window. The sign had numbers printed on its edges: 25, 50, 75, or 100. Whichever number was turned upright told the passing iceman exactly how many pounds of ice the household needed that day. The Iceman was a figure of immense physical strength. He would stop the wagon, check the window cards, and step to the back of his cart. Using a heavy steel ice pick, he would score and chip a massive block to the exact requested weight. In the sweltering heat of August, the arrival of the ice wagon was a neighborhood event. Children would chase the heavy wagon down the street, trailing behind the dripping water. They would gather around the back of the cart, waiting for the Iceman to use his pick. When the heavy blocks split, they would scramble for the sharp, freezing splinters of ice that fell to the cobblestones, sucking on them as a rare and precious summer treat. The Iceman would then grip the block with a heavy pair of iron tongs. He would swing the massive, freezing weight onto his shoulder, protected by a thick leather pad, and carry it through the back door. He would wrestle the block directly into the top compartment of the kitchen icebox, bringing a piece of the winter directly into the home. For nearly a century, this was how the modern world stayed cool. It was a massive, delicate infrastructure, dependent entirely on the weather. If a winter was too mild, the ice crop would fail, creating a panic known as an ice famine. But like many quiet physical systems of the 19th century, the natural ice trade was destined to be replaced by the invisible forces of modernity. The decline did not happen overnight. In the early 20th century, engineers began to perfect the mechanics of artificial refrigeration. Breweries and meatpacking plants were the first to adopt these large, ammonia-based cooling machines, freeing themselves from the unpredictable winters. Eventually, the technology shrank. By the 1920s and 30s, the electric refrigerator entered the home. It was a self-contained unit wrapped in white enamel. It didn't need sawdust. It didn't need a horse-drawn wagon. It didn't leave puddles on the floor. And it didn't need the freezing lakes of New England. It simply needed to be plugged into a wall. The transition was quiet, but absolute. The steady hum of the electric compressor replaced the daily drip of the drain pan. The wooden ice boxes were hauled out to the alleys or repurposed into storage cabinets. The massive, windowless ice houses by the ponds were abandoned. Over the decades, they slowly rotted away or burned down in spectacular, forgotten fires fueled by the dry sawdust left inside. The Iceman drove his route less and less until one day the horses were retired and he simply never came back. Today, the entire global infrastructure of the natural ice trade has vanished almost without a trace. We summon the cold at the push of a button, completely divorced from the natural changing of the seasons. But there is a certain poetry to what we have lost. The next time you hold a piece of ice in your hand, listening to it crackle as it meets a warm drink, think about the effort it once took to create that simple sensation. Think about the heavy iron saws, the towering ancient yachtals, the smell of damp sawdust in the hull of a ship crossing the equator, and the quiet, wooden boxes that briefly managed to capture the winter and hold it still.